Hello, everybody. Welcome back from your weekend. Welcome to Bearing the Brunt. Experimenting with some titles for this live stream, so if you like it, go ahead and let me know. Bearing the Brunt. I've come up with brainstormed with a friend of mine some other possible titles. Brunt Force Trauma. That's really it. The Brunt of It. Oh, that's the other one. The Brunt of It. Bearing the Brunt. Brunt Force Trauma. Play on my last name, Van Brunt. Hey guys, I'm Joel Van Brunt, and I am here to help you avoid outsourcing your thinking, to help you discern and have wisdom while tampering down your passions about things so that you can have discernment and wisdom. And developing that skill of discernment, let's endeavor to incrementally improve in our wisdom and discernment as we explore things together. We cling to our narratives and models at our own peril. So this is something I talked about in the last several episodes, and that's what we do. We cling to our narratives and models at our own peril. I'm not advocating for radical skepticism. I am simply advocating to have grown-up conversations that are marked with wisdom and discernment and graciousness for each other. And I seek grown-up conversations, vice a 5th grade recess session. So that's my goal. I hope you will join me in that endeavor. So starting off today, I want to talk a little bit about the COVID improvement plan, and specifically my project A, project B, etc. So my project A is to learn day trading. That was a little bit rough this morning. Honestly, I did well with a few of my trades, but one of my trades, I actually held on to the stock overnight, so we'll see how that goes. I'm hoping it'll come up. And it was in the oil and gas market. So if you've seen the news today, you could probably guess which way that stock went. Anyway, so not so good in that endeavor, but overall, I am seeking to Project A get better with day trading and just learn about the stock market. I don't really care that much about making money, although it would be cool to make money as a day trader if that's something in the future for me. And Project B is this podcast and live stream. So I endeavor to get 1% better each and every day with both of those. So, this morning I had 3 trades. I actually had 4 trades, and 3 of them, I think I had 5 trades. I'm sorry. I had 5 trades. 3 of them were green and 2 of them were red. The red one of the red ones was not much. The other red one was pretty bad. I held on to it. I have this theory that if you swing trade some bad day trades, then and give it a little bit of a chance to come up in the future, especially if you look at the previous 20 days or the previous 6 months and kind of see where it's been hanging out, then you may not lose that money. I don't know. I'm experimenting with different approaches. And then, Project B with this live stream, I'm trying to get better at it. So what are my improvements today, you may ask? Well, I've got these things. Now, you might think that these are new high-speed earpieces or headphones. You would be wrong. I've had these for, the last 15, 20 years, and they're kind of falling apart. But I left my other inner ear pieces inside, so, in the main house, my family's sleeping, so I get to do this when they're sleeping. Anyway, so I actually like this. The sound in this is good. I have this Yeti blue microphone, USB microphone that I've been using. And now I'm shooting on a Canon 80D, which I think has a much better image. Also, you may notice the couch is now behind me. So I used to be sitting on the couch, if you look at episodes prior to this. And now I'm actually sitting in a chair. And I did that because my back started to hurt when I was kind of hunched forward and speaking into the microphone on the couch. So that's an improvement for my posture. And I'm experimenting also with the layout. So I have 2 computers. I have kind of my streaming computer, and then I have my notes computer. I put my notes computer on my left side. It's usually over here on my right side. So I'm not left-handed, I'm right-handed. So we'll see how that goes. And then you may notice that back here, where is it? Back here to the side of my couch, there's no wrapping paper. So there used to be wrapping paper back there. If you go back to the other streams, you'll see wrapping paper. I want to face this way so you can see a nice plain background behind me. If I face that way or this way, it's cluttery and I don't necessarily have the time to turn it into something presentable. I'm sure maybe one or two of you can relate to that. So anyway, those are my improvements for today. So who am I? Joel Van Brunt. I'm hoping to help guide you through the fog of war, which is life. The fog of war, we are constantly trying to choose how we think about things based on incomplete information, based on what people are reporting to us. And this can be politically, this can be philosophically, this can be worldview, this can be just life help, this could be pessimists, optimists. And we are literally navigating life in this fog of war with this uncertainty about the state of reality and the state of things. So I'm hoping to help guide you through that, and along the way help you improve your discernment and your wisdom about the information that comes in. Why do I want to do this? Well, I have 20 years experience in the private sector, in the government, and in academia. And it's a very diverse, broad experience. I've worked out of 8 states. I've lived in 6 states as an adult. And I've been in the military. I've been combat deployed. I've been an starving actor in LA. I've been a grad school student. I've been a small business manager and executive. And and I've been a startup co-founder. So I've had a whole broad breadth of experience. And I think that experience can help maybe contextualize an approach to discernment about the information we take into our brains, specifically, culturally and politically. That's my hope with this live stream. So again, 20 years experience. I think I've worked for 40 different people in those 20 years. So about two different people a year on average. I've seen so many different leadership styles that, I start to lose track. The military in the Marine Corps especially is literally a leadership factory. And you can see great examples of leadership. You can see very poor examples of leadership. And when you develop your own leadership style, you start to pull from this person and not do what this other person did that you didn't like. And it's actually a really fun process. And you get to experiment, you get to fail, you get to hone your leadership skills. And from day one, when you enter the door as a young second lieutenant, you are learning leadership skills. So I have a particular leadership philosophy I'd like to bring to this conversation as well. And in my direct reports over the years, I've had direct reports for about the last 6 years in various capacities. And as it's ramped up, I've been in charge of upwards of about 280 people. So, there's layers of managers below me. And so I've had to instill motivation and some guidance and leadership mentorship to them. And I want to kind of start with some concepts, and I'll probably go through a concept every episode for the next few episodes, just to help you strap into my thinking, and hopefully it helps you. So the biggest thing, the biggest principle, and I've talked about this before, is instilling a continuous improvement mindset in your organization or your people. So, what I do is I do this 1% improvement, 1% daily improvement thinking. And what that looks like is no matter what it is, I learned it in the customer service realm. So the way I initially learned it, which was about 7 years ago, was in the customer service realm. You should be striving to get 1% better in delivering great customer service as a business. And that 1% improvement spread in my thinking to cover almost everything in the small business I was working in. Internally, our structure, our operating procedures, our best practices, our policies, all those kinds of things, our relationships, our team building, and our expectation management. There's a whole slew that this daily 1% improvement can apply to. It can also apply to our health and fitness. It can also apply to our relationships. So that's my principal, guiding, starting out the gate. The principal guidance I give to my direct reports is, hey, I expect you to take on a mindset of daily 1% improvements, and I expect you to instill that in your people. So that's what I'm trying to do with this podcast. That's why I covered the improvements in the beginning. But that's my primary, my first principle that I kind of extend to my direct reports. So that's a little bit about my background, and in that background, in a couple different capacities, whether it was on stage as an actor or in a helicopter squadron leading and missions and getting debriefed afterwards, you learn a really valuable skill set. And that skill set I would submit is constructive discernment of the input you're getting on your performance. You're taking the constructiveness and you're incorporating it into your process, and then you're identifying comments or input that is not constructive, and you're letting that just kind of pass over you. And it helps to have a thick skin. It helps to not take things too personally. And I would submit that this principle can apply when we're taking in information about the world around us, politically, culturally, etc. You want to interrogate the information coming in and see if it's going to be beneficial for you or maybe not beneficial for you. And one criteria that you may use, which I would encourage, is it going to increase your negative emotion, or is it going to maybe decrease and offer you new information that might help you retain a bigger picture? So I've been trying to hone this skill myself for the last 15 years or so, and I hope to share some practices that will make you better at that as well. So another leadership principle that I will cover before moving on is I challenge my direct reports to assume the best of others until proven otherwise. And if you are on a team or if you've managed people, you may have seen a breakdown in the team or problems with a particular person because there's a mismatch between that person's perception of the team or other people and perhaps what the reality is of the situation. And you could see how a subtle shift towards ill intent of another team member or a different department or this manager or that manager can be poisonous. As soon as you start assuming ill intent, it can really negatively impact the team. So I encourage my direct reports to assume the best of others until proven otherwise. It doesn't whitewash any kind of nefarious intent. There are selfish people out there and make selfish decisions. That's certainly true. And so I strive to do that. Now, as for me personally, with the different backgrounds I was exposed to growing up, I grew up in a stable family in Western New York State, Rochester. And when I was growing up, my parents initially were churchgoers up until the time I was about 7. And then they stopped going to church. My extended family had a whole broad array of different worldviews. So both sets of grandparents on my mom's side and my dad's side were both Unitarian Universalists. So Unitarian Universalism is not Christian. It's not really abiding by any kind of supernatural belief, although supernatural belief is welcome in the church. It's more of like a postmodern humanistic philosophical religious institution. So both sets of grandparents were Unitarian Universalists. And I remember going with my grandfather on my mom's side to a couple services when I was a young adult and, seeing what they would do. So that was them. Then each of my parents were siblings of 4, had, total of 4 siblings. They had 3 brothers and or sisters. So my dad, on his side, his oldest brother turned into a very, very far leftist politically. And I heard recently in the 70s, 60s and 70s thought about actually traveling to China to help the Mao government with some issues with Taiwan and Hong Kong and whatnot. So that's how radical he was. And he has maintained that radical stance all the way up to the present day. And I've had some high emotional conversations with him as an adult, which were interesting to say the least. It really allowed me to peek back behind the curtain of what hardcore leftist ideology looks like. And I can't claim to be an expert in it, but personally in my family, I have that connection. And then if you go down the next sibling, so my dad's older sister, she became a Christian, and now she is doing a lot of missionary work. Her husband is deceased, my uncle, and all her, all my cousins are out of the house, so she's doing missionary work, out of her house and going to various places. So she was a Christian. My dad was a third, and he was kind of undecided until the end of his life, in which case he became a Christian as well. And then my dad's younger brother is more of a hedonist, more of a seeking pleasure and maybe a humanist, hedonist type hybrid. Then on my mom's side, my mom's oldest sister, she became an objectivist. Now, objectivism, for those of you who don't know, follows the philosophy of Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand being this thinker. She immigrated from Russia in right around the 1918 mark, the Bolshevik Revolution. So sometime around that time, she immigrated to the U.S. She became a screenwriter for Hollywood. She wrote some really good books, The Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged. And so she founded this philosophy that a lot of people will follow. That's objectivism. So that was my mom's oldest sister. Then her next sister became a Christian and was a missionary in Africa for about 7 or 8 years after my cousins left the house with her husband. And then my mom's brother, who deceased when I was 2 years old, he was kind of more in that humanist, hedonist type level, I would suppose. I don't know. I'd have to ask my mom. I didn't really know him personally. I just heard stories about him. And then my mom, who traveled around a whole different array of worldviews and thinking throughout the course of her life. So that's what I grew up with. And I remember in high school and in college and as a young adult having really interesting discussions with my aunts and uncles, my grandparents, my parents, and getting passionate about it. And we love to discuss these ideas. And as a developing person, I wasn't sure where I fell. Now, for me personally, where I ended up is I became a Christian and dedicated my life to that worldview in my young 20s. After I joined the military, and after some friends of mine in the military when I was in flight school offered me a compelling Christian narrative, one I hadn't heard before. And so after I heard that, and I was certainly open to the idea of a Christian God and the person of Jesus Christ, the historical person of Jesus. So in hearing about that, I ended up making that commitment, and I've been that way ever since. But I have a distinct interest in philosophy. So I was never formally trained in philosophy, but I've had an interest in that for the last 10 years or so. In apologetics with Christianity. So I've been engaging and listening to those arguments for about the last 10 years as well. And formally, my academic training has been very different. I've got a math science brain. I was very good at math in high school. So I was an electrical engineering graduate from Northwestern University. So I had the mathematical stuff. And my minor was acting. So I had the artistic stuff as well. And if I panned around the room, you would see maybe 8 or 9 different instruments in the room. So I have a whole bunch of guitars here. I have a keyboard, a nice Korg keyboard. I have an electronic drum set and a Fender amp. So I've got, this interest in a whole wide array of different disciplines. And what that's done in my life now, I'm the classic generalist, can't decide what I want to do with my life is the big criticism. But what that's allowed me to do throughout the course of my life is come into contact with different groups who are more narrow in their focus than I was. So when I was living in LA, for example, I spent a year and a half immersed in the artistic enterprise with the people I was with. I was in a theater company and I did short films. I did a couple features. And then when I was, in undergrad with the engineering curriculum, I was immersed with that rational, logical mindset. All my classmates who I was, staying up all night with to do problem sets. So I saw that part of it. And then in grad school and academia, I was immersed in this higher level thinking. And that's where I was first exposed to things like ethics and philosophy, because I didn't have a formal training in that before. And it really sparked an interest in me. I've always been interested in politics ever since I was, a kid. I think my earliest memory was seeing Reagan's inauguration and I was about 3 or 4 years old. So that's one of my earliest memories politically. So all that to say that I think that not only my family upbringing and my family experience, but also my personal experience in a whole different set of domains, artistically and intellectually, equips me with a slightly different mindset where I've surveyed a broad range of views, and what I've noticed is that there is a trend, and this is not a criticism, but there's a trend when you're narrowly focused in something that you will be sometimes very, very wedded to that narrow focus and resistant to other kinds of information. You have this confirmation bias that happens, and all of us are subject to confirmation bias, myself included. So I'm not going to, only cut one way. But I've noticed that the generalists tend to, and those brains that have experience in different domains tend to have the higher level conversations and the grown-up conversations. The ones who are more narrowly focused, maybe younger, tend to have the fifth grade recess conversations. That's just an observation. I know that's a broad statement, and there's certainly exceptions to that. But my hope is that with that background, I can offer you some techniques, again, to navigate this fog of war that we have in life. So a little bit about the process. I think about some big picture stuff I want to talk about at the beginning of these sessions, and then I go into some specifics with the news cycles and some stories, in modern times. So that's how I prepare. I open up literally every single website you could think of. Well, not every single one, but the main ones. Fox News, CNN, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Vox, National Review, Real Clear Politics, and a handful of others, a slew of others. So the only aggregator in the sense that I have is Real Clear Politics, and then Twitter. I'll go on the news thing on Twitter. Apple News sometimes, Yahoo News sometimes, but less so for those because I found Real Clear Politics to be my favorite aggregator of news. And so I scan all of the stories, and I read, anywhere from 5 stories if I want to narrow the focus down, all the way up to 20 stories in preparation for this live stream. And I kind of build a picture of how I want to incorporate the stories into some of my overall thinking about life and some of the things I just discussed. So that's my process. I'm trying to improve it. I'm trying to keep these podcasts to under an hour. I'm not succeeding recently. They've been going over an hour, but I'm hoping to keep them between 45 minutes and an hour. That's my goal anyway. But, maybe the right answer is to go longer. I'm not exactly sure on the way forward with that. So without further ado, I asked a question on Twitter over the weekend that will help contextualize, this next discussion point. But the question on Twitter, and I go back and forth for background. I go back and forth on Twitter with one of my friends who I've been friends with since college. So we've been friends for 24 years or so. And he and I are on the opposite sides politically. He's an agnostic. I'm a Christian. He's a Democrat. I'm a Republican. He's liberal. I'm conservative. And we have been going back and forth for literally the last 14, 15 years. We didn't do it so much in college. We did it more as young adults when we were in LA together. And he's a great friend. I love him to death. Good thinker, good critical thinker. But we just disagree. And so I've been going back and forth with him for about 14 years, like I said. And 12 years ago, he and I actually did a podcast together, which was great fun. So we did that for about a year and a half early on in the whole YouTube and podcasting scene. And then we kind of split ways and went different directions. But we still debate on Twitter. So I asked him this question recently on Twitter, I think this weekend. I said, and I'm paraphrasing the question, but I basically said, does hatred and other extreme emotions lead to better awareness or worse awareness of an issue or person? So that's a hypothetical question. Does hatred, condemnation, other extreme emotion lead to better awareness or worse awareness of an issue or person? And what I'm trying to bring out in this question is that, the emotions that we go through really do have an impact on our our willingness to accept information from outside that's challenging of a prior position. And you see this literally all the time if you start looking for it. You really do. So I asked that question. Of course, that caused some back and forth. But that will be pertinent here as I get into some of the stories. So First, I'm going to start off with some COVID updates. I guess today we went past the seasonal flu average. At least that's what Real Clear Politics is reporting. That we are now at 42,263 deaths, and that's surpassing the seasonal flu deaths of 40,905. So that's, fortunately, I think most of the graphs are showing us coming down on that bell curve. But that's the most recent thing with COVID. And the other day, on Saturday, I covered the CDC timeline in February, submitting that, this fog of war defense that I've heard proposed for not just our administration, but other leaders around the world for the February actions. I propose this fog of war defense, or defense is a bad word, but more explanation for why, real serious action didn't start getting taken until March. And so I covered this real long CDC timeline on Saturday. And I wanted to go through in detail because I wanted to show that there is a real thing, as such a thing as a fog of war in organizations and in enterprises and in life. So I think the CDC has some answering. There's a lot of information they were having. There's some problems with the testing that I covered then, and they were clashing with top FDA officials. I covered that on Saturday. And a couple articles I wanted to point out. So there's one, and this will help to set the context as well. So there's an article from Quartz, which is kind of a fun article. It's called "The Difference Between a Snafu, a Show, and a Cluster." Okay, so I'm going to try not to swear, but these are three military terms. So anybody who's a military person would be immediately familiar with these terms. And this article by Quartz is great because it basically it cites some Stanford business people, professors, who use these words to describe how any organization, any business can be set up and run, and graduates of top business schools will go into these organizations. And of course, they go in, with big eyes and big dreams and big expectations. And then they learn that the actual day-to-day operations and the interplay and the organizational friction that exists is a surprise. Many people are like that. And so you will start to fall into one of these categories: a snafu, a cluster, or a show, right? So let me just read a little bit of this because I think it's good. So let's say the situation at work is not good. The project or product or reorganization or whatever has launched, and the best you can say is that things aren't going as planned at all. It's a disaster, though the best word for it is the one you drop over drinks with your team and when venting at home. It's a cluster. Cluster hold a special place in public life, one distinct from the complications, crises, and catastrophes that mar our personal and professional existences. The F word, former Oxford English Dictionary editor Jesse Sidelower's comprehensive history of the term, defines a cluster as a bungled or confused undertaking or situation. Stanford business professor Bob Sutton goes further, describing cluster as those debacles and disasters caused by a deadly brew of illusion, impatience, incompetence that afflicts too many decision makers, especially those in powerful, confident, and prestigious groups. The term dates at least back as far as the Vietnam War as military slang for doomed decisions resulting from toxic combination of too many high-ranking officers and too little on-the-ground information. The cluster part of the word allegedly refers to the officers' oak leaves on their collar insignia. So to appreciate what that is, there's some background given in this article, which is great. So number one, a F up. So an F up is just something all of us do every day. Sutton says, I broke an egg I made for breakfast this morning. That kind of thing is an F up. Whereas cluster Fs are perfectly preventable. F ups are an unavoidable feature of the human condition. So his statement is cluster Fs are preventable. A snafu, while sometimes used as a synonym for minor malfunctions and hiccups, this slang military acronym, situation normal, all effed up, actually refers to the functionally messy state that describes many otherwise healthy companies and many of our personal lives. A snafu work environment is usually manageable. One that is FUBAR, effed up beyond all repair, another military legacy, probably isn't. So So snafu is a work environment, usually manageable, and a foobar probably isn't. And this is all relating to organizations, right? When my students, this is quoting the Stanford professor, when my students with little experience go to work at a famous company and it isn't quite as they dreamed, I do ask them if it's a foobar or a snafu, and they tell me snafu will describe most of their situations. S-show. No less an authority than the Oxford English Dictionary describes an S-show as a situation or state of affairs characterized by chaos, confusion, or incompetence. A cluster F may come to possess all of those characteristics, but is more properly identified by the decisions that produced it than its outcome. The three main contributors to cluster Fs: illusion, impatience, incompetence. So that's just a brief setup for what I'm about to talk about. So this is universal of any organization, I would submit. Any organization you're in, small business, medium-sized business, large business, public sector, private sector, nonprofit, are going to have aspects of this dysfunction. And those of you who have been in organizations, any of them, you'll see that. You will see that. Communication challenges, this fog of war that's happening where you're trying to analyze the market and these people aren't listening to these people. Operations are just doing their thing. Engineers are doing their thing. No one's talking to each other. Silo effect. All these things combine to create this snafu environment. And it's universal of organizational behavior. And one of my interests is organizations and making them more efficient and understanding them, making them have less friction and operate better and be more beneficial to public health, people's mental states, sense of accomplishment for the worker and the participants. So that's been an interest of mine for a long time in various capacities. And I've tried to apply that interest in positive ways in the roles that I've had. So the setup gets us into this Washington Post article. So I covered that CDC stuff, and this Washington Post article just came out this morning, or maybe it was yesterday. It was yesterday. And the article is titled, "Americans at World Health Organization Transmitted Real-Time Information About Coronavirus to Trump Administration." So that's the title. Now, you'll see in a moment that the Trump administration means the CDC. So there's been a defense against the fog of war argument in the last 24 hours or so that says, hey, all these CDC people were embedded with the World Health Organization. How could there possibly not have been good information in the administration to take action in February? So that's the kind of the setup. So notice first that the title talks about Trump administration as opposed to just the CDC, which it could have said, but it didn't. And you may want to take notice of how that makes you feel wherever you are in the political spectrum just right now. So let me just dive into this. This is by Karen DeYoung. More than a dozen U.S. researchers, physicians, and public health experts, many of them from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, were working full-time at the Geneva headquarters of the World Health Organization as the novel coronavirus emerged late last year and transmitted real-time information about its discovery and spread in China to the Trump administration, according to U.S. and international officials. A number of CDC staff members are regularly detailed to work at the WHO in Geneva as part of a rotation that has operated for years. Senior Trump-appointed health officials also consulted regularly at the highest levels with the World Health Organization as the crisis unfolded, the official said. The presence of so many U.S. officials undercuts President Trump's assertion that the WHO's failure to communicate the extent of the threat, born of the desire to protect China, is largely responsible for the rapid spread of the virus in the United States. The administration also sharply criticized the Chinese government for withholding information. But the president, who often touts a personal relationship with President Xi, is reluctant to inflict damage on a trade deal with Beijing, appears to view the WHO as a more defenseless target. In a statement provided by the Washington Post after online publication of this article, Caitlin B. Oakley, a spokesman for the Department of Health and Human Services, confirmed that in January, HHS has 17 staff members, including 16 from CDC, at the WHO, working in a variety of programs, including COVID-19 and Ebola. She emphasized that the staff members were not decision makers. Okay, I'm going to start right there because I have experience in this domain. In the military, it is very common for staffers to go intermingle with foreign militaries, to get embedded in overseas in Europe, to deploy, to work with other militaries, other communities, other governments, etc. Now, that information, any pertinent information in that dialogue or discussion, even if it's really urgent and important, has to make its way back up the chain of command. And it's not clear that the most important information always makes its way back up the chain of command. And again, this goes back to any organization and that friction that organizations have, going back to my previous article. So it's possible that just because these CDC members were embedded and were working closely with the WHO, even if they had good information, which I will just grant for the sake of this discussion, that's not clear at all, whether their information on COVID-19 was clear or not. Even if they did have clear information and they're transmitting that back to CDC back in the US, it's not clear that that information is now making it outside the CDC in a helpful sense. And another comment I want to make is that information that one department or organization views as critical and important, so important, it is a difficult communication challenge to really cause action outside of your organization, especially if somebody outside of your organization looks at the same information and goes, I'm not sure that's as important as you think it is. And let me tell you, that happens all the time. If you work with engineering departments, if you work with different sections in a unit or so, what they're working on at the time is the most important thing. And any problem with what they're working on that is not acknowledged and understood by their chain of command is therefore, they're not supporting what we want. This is the critical thing that we have to do, and the bosses aren't getting behind this. And again, this is the friction. This is the cluster F that I just mentioned. So that's what I'll offer. Furthermore, and then another quote from this person. Furthermore, I'd add that just because you have Americans embedded in the WHO providing technical assistance does not change the information you are getting from WHO leadership, Oakley said in an email. Okay, so that's calling into question the information. We have learned now that the WHO information was incorrect and relied too heavily on China, end quote. Questioning why the WHO, quote, did not press China harder, she said that, quote, the lack of transparency aided and abided by WHO leadership hampered understanding of the virus and delayed the global response. So even if the CDC is embedded in the WHO, which it obviously was, and the information they had was not the best, and that incomplete information is getting transferred back to CDC stateside, it's not clear that made it up to the top. And even if it did, it would be contributing to the fog of war. So this whole article's premise is designed, the whole thing is designed to make you call into question, what did the administration know and when, and what did Trump know and when, and this as a way to undermine Trump's arguments to blame China, and also in the back of your mind maybe raise questions about, what did he know and why didn't he take more action? Should have done it earlier kind of attack. So anyway, I just offer those as ideas to consider when you get these articles. And I would draw out a couple techniques. So I looked at the wording, and then I looked at what the wording was referencing. So Trump administration turns out means CDC and some other health officials in the administration, though those are unspecified. And then, it does talk about the information that the embedded CDC members were getting, but it doesn't do that until down in the article, right? So if you don't read very far, or you just read the headline, you might get a reaction, dopamine hit or something, or some sort of confirmation emotional response in your brain that confirms, your thoughts about Trump or the administration. And you won't dive down and kind of ask these larger questions. So some techniques are, be mindful of how things make you feel, be mindful of the words used, and then, look for confirmation in the article itself about what the title suggests it's saying, what the title of the piece suggests it's saying. So enough on that. That's a good one. Moving on. There's also, so in the Daily Caller, there was a piece that New York City is forming a COVID anti-discrimination response team. And I talked a little bit ago about, a couple days ago, earlier this week, I can't remember what day, but just being cautious of causes being linked to COVID and being linked to the COVID response. And you'll see this with federalism. You'll see this with states' rights. You'll see this with, emergency response. You'll see this with public health. You'll see this with socialism. You'll see this with capitalism. So you'll see all these causes linked to the COVID reaction. And this is, in my view, not a helpful linking with setting up this anti-discrimination response team. So discrimination is already illegal. And I would think that the police department would be able to, handle any kind of complaints of harassment. But instead, they have special anti-discrimination response teams, which is a little bit alarming to me, because now it's making this special response to this cause, which is this racist narrative in the U.S. And I do want to pose another hypothetical question for folks on the racism issue specifically. And this has been a main line of attack by the left against the Trump administration, against Trump supporters. He's a racist, fascist, sexist, bigoted, homophobic, misogynist. I'm trying to see if I miss anything. Anyway, that's been, the drumbeat very early on. So if that's, and we live in a racist, a structural racist society, and a lot of the Democratic candidates, back in the debates were talking about reparations. Cory Booker, I think was suggesting some of those things, and Tom Steyer, some others. So anyway, don't quote me on those ones, because this is just going off recollection. But so that's the narrative. Now, would that narrative predict that you would have record low unemployment among Black Americans and Hispanic Americans? So in other words, if it's true that we are systemically racist, and that half the country or 40% of the country is just demonstrated their racism and their misogyny by voting for Trump, then would you expect a couple of years later for there to be record low Black unemployment and the highest employment numbers in minority communities? Would you expect that? I don't think so. I mean, I think if the racism is there, then you wouldn't expect that to happen. That's my hunch. So anyway, I pose that as hypothetical. And as you've seen, probably states are starting to open up this week. Texas, I think today, is starting to open up. And there's something missing in the larger conversation, which is the risk assessment. And in my capacity as a pilot, so I didn't mention I'm a pilot. I kind of alluded to that earlier, but I've been a pilot for 20 years, and I fly airplanes and helicopters. And one thing we do is risk management, risk assessment, risk mitigation. So you try to mitigate the risks as best you can, but you can't eliminate risks. The only way you can eliminate risks is to not operate, to not fly an airplane. The only way you can eliminate risks in an automobile is to not drive it. And there's a piece about how the lockdown has led to the largest decrease. Let me see if I can find this article real quick. The largest decrease in fatalities. So let's see. I may not have pulled this up. Yeah, here it is. So this is an interesting study. So this pertains to the risk discussion. Okay. COVID-19 is our number one event that has caused a reduction in fatal crashes. Okay, let me start at the top. The ads were just popping up in my screen, so it skipped me for a moment. This is a piece in the Daily Caller by Jason Hopkins. The coronavirus pandemic has led to a substantial drop in traffic fatalities across the United States, a study discovered. The spread of coronavirus, which has infected over 500,000 people in the U.S. and killed more than 30,000, has sparked a dramatic downturn in the traffic fatalities, according to a study by Auto Insurance Easy. The study found that the pandemic has stemmed more fatal crashes than any other historical event in the United States. COVID-19 is our number one event that has caused a reduction in fatal crashes. We can assume that if total crashes are down, fatal crashes have fallen as well, the study's authors wrote. It has likely caused a reduction in the fatal crashes across America, from big cities such as New York City to smaller cities such as Glendale, Arizona, where more pedestrians are killed each year than in crashes from drunk drivers. The study, among many details, found that Seattle saw a drop of 100% in fatal accidents. Massachusetts reported 75% drop in crashes. Accidents dropped 51% in Los Angeles, and crashes in New York City fell 33% near the beginning of March. What were the study's key findings? The coronavirus pandemic has reduced fatal traffic accidents more than Hurricane Irene, Hurricane Harvey, and 2016 presidential election and other major events. All of these events sparked a drop in transportation and thus traffic accidents, but none of them compared to the effect COVID-19 has had on the U.S. transportation sector. Okay, that makes sense, right? That isn't surprising that because people are driving less, you'd have less accidents and therefore less fatalities. But this shows you that the only way to reduce the risk to zero is to not drive, right? The only way to reduce the risk of flying to zero is to not fly. The only way to reduce the risk of, you name the activity that involves risk, is to not do it. So the same thing is with COVID-19. The only way to reduce the risk of COVID-19 to zero is to lock ourselves indoors for the next 18 months until a vaccine comes out. And some, sadly, are advocating that position. But I think those advocating that position are not familiar with risk management and risk decision making. Insurance companies are very well aware of risk management, risk decision making. In fact, they put numbers to human life. So, for example, in the aviation insurance sector, loosely speaking, you can insure an aircraft for anywhere from $4 to $5 million per head, all the way up to maybe $10 million per head for the number of people that you're carrying in an aircraft. So my stream just froze. Let me see if it comes back. Okay, looks like it came back. Okay, so insurance companies and actuaries, these are people whose professions are to look at risk. Pilots, that's one of their pre-flight duties is to look at the risk. Now, the rest of the country, and let's say an artist or a writer, maybe not familiar with assessing risk, or a public health expert, maybe not entirely familiar with assessing the universal risk or risk management. They might have a refined look at the risk of a pandemic and the spread and that kind of stuff, the R naught that we've heard about in the models. But I just wanted to draw out, this dialogue. So that's not happening. So basically what's happening is these protests are happening across the country, in Michigan and other places to reopen. And now we're starting to get a clash between those who think the protesters are out of line and, endangering public health, and, healthcare workers or others who are weathering the storm and maybe not living paycheck to paycheck that are demonizing these protesters. And if you want to really pit Americans against each other, then don't talk about the risk decisions. Don't talk about the risk management decisions. And keep in mind that the protesters are protesting to come back to work. Okay? When have we had a protest to come back to work in American history? We haven't, to my knowledge. So when Trump tweets things like liberate Michigan, liberate, these other states, and the left goes crazy, well, what are they protesting? They're not protesting police brutality against African Americans. They're not protesting, LGBT rights issues. They're not protesting, whatever. They're not protesting some other cause, political cause. They're literally protesting the right to go back to work and the right to go walk about freely in the common spaces. So there's a lot of dictatorial tendencies that are coming out of this, and you'll notice that half the population, maybe not quite, is on the side of more dictatorial control, more authoritarian control in the interest of public health. And the other side of the country is more in favor of, hey, it's our right to get back to work. I mean, we as Americans get back to work. I can make a risk decision for myself. I don't need the government necessarily to make a decision for me and for my family. So that's kind of the play out that's happening, and it's that kind of nuance is lost in the discussion. And I wish it wasn't. I wish that we would discuss the risk more. There's also an interesting piece by Quillette. I love Quillette. It's a great publication out of Australia. And Joel Kotkin, I kind of honed in on that because of his first name, same name as me. So I wanted to briefly read some of this study. His piece is titled Viral Politics. And basically he's saying, I'll just read it. He's basically saying this is going to have long-term impacts on our society and political life. So long after the pandemic has receded, its long-term impact on our society and political life will continue, just as plagues in the past have reshaped the trajectory of cities and civilizations, sometimes with fearsome morbidity. COVID-19 is already having a profoundly disruptive impact on our political future. Rather than uniting humanity against a common foe, the pandemic seems to be widening the internal political chasm between nations and within them. The battle, war, or crusade against the novel coronavirus has not to date reprised the London Blitz, Pearl Harbor, or the World Trade Center attack in 2001, during which people closed ranks, even if they thought little of their country's leaders. Democrats, like party strategists James Carville and Speaker Nancy Pelosi, insist that Trump has, quote, blood on his hands. And one of Pelosi's more excitable colleagues has suggested that Trump be tried at The Hague for his handling of the pandemic. It's a good way to bring people together. On the right, meanwhile, the pandemic has engendered in the US and elsewhere a predictably anti-China and nativist tone, which have sometimes drifted into overt racism, particularly in Italy. Some journalists toss around terms like Manchurian media, a regrettable throwback to McCarthyism. This is no way to handle a global pandemic. Most Americans, according to a recent survey, would prefer a more collaborative approach. They have so far been disappointed. At a time when we need a rational discussion of policy alternatives and a thoughtful debate among experts, including not just epidemiologists, but also economists, psychologists, and social scientists, we are seeing an escalation of finger-pointing, blame-shifting, and character assassination from both sides. Okay. Yes, yes, and yes. It goes on. It's a great article in Quillette by this guy, Joel Kotkin. And this is exactly what I'm seeing in Twitter, and exactly what's playing out in the president's press conferences. So the gotcha questions that I think have toned down a little bit. I haven't been keeping up on the press conferences as much as I'd like. But looking backwards, and what do you say to Americans who might be disappointed and playing down and all these tweets, we're looking at your tweets back in February and back in March and replaying that same narrative over and over and over and over again as a way to cast blame and cast judgment and point fingers. How's that helpful? How's that helpful? Would you say that engaging in finger pointing and engaging in judgment and blame at this point in the process helps us or hurts us? It's just simple. I mean, intuitively, we all, I believe, know what the answer is. So if you find yourself engaging in that or being led into that, because let's be honest, our emotions cause action, in our brains. So when we see something that sparks emotion, strong emotion in us on a headline, we're going to latch onto that. And then we're going to be subject to confirmation bias and cognitive dissonance, all of us. So I'm in agreement with this writer. And, my goal is that we can elevate the conversation and get better. And like I said, have a grown-up conversation rather than a fifth grade recess conversation. And hopefully you can do that 1% daily with me. All right. Other news, we've seen oil briefly going negative. This is the futures, I guess. And this is crazy. I don't think I've ever seen oil go negative. So this is out of New York Times. Oil plummets as storage capacity runs low, and a quirk in pricing wipes out one benchmark. Something bizarre happened in the markets on Monday. The price of a barrel of oil went negative. Oil price was tumbled as the economic crisis set off by the coronavirus pandemic continued to destroy demand for energy, and as concerns grew that storage tanks in the United States were near capacity and unable to hold all the unused crude. The bizarre movement in the market on Monday was exaggerated by a quirk in the way oil prices are set. Traders pay varying prices depending on the grade of crude, where it comes from, and the date on which it is meant to be delivered. These are futures, I believe, that they're talking about. Normally, these differences are small, and they go unnoticed outside of the energy market. But on Monday, they were exacerbated by sharp swings in the price. A benchmark for oil that will be delivered next month went negative, meaning it was essentially deemed worthless, suggesting that people who had oil to sell were willing to pay for it to be taken off their hands. Oil that is scheduled to be delivered in June, more reflective of the market's view on what the value of crude is right now, also fell, sliding 16% to about $21 a barrel. The problem is that the United States is running out of places to store its oil. Oil is already being stockpiled on barges out at sea and in many nook and cranny companies to find in their storage facilities. Now traders are worrying that even more space is running out. Under futures contracts, West Texas Intermediate, the American oil price benchmark, is delivered to Cushing, Oklahoma, but investors are worried that there will be no place to put it there. Cushing inventories continues to increase at record high rates and are expected to hit top hit tank tops in May, said Hillary Stevenson, director of oil markets at Genscape, a market intelligence firm. Broader worries also growing of the deal reached on April 12th between the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, Russia, and other producers will not be sufficient to prevent the oil markets being overwhelmed with a record surge of surplus oil. This is the first time this has ever happened, to my knowledge, that we do not have enough places to put the oil. Fascinating development. We'll see how this plays out. Again, one of my stock picks this morning, I didn't read the story. I didn't see it come out. Bad on me. But so one of my picks this morning started to probably get affected by this. Anyway, so that's kind of big news. We'll see how that plays out. Now, in theory, once the economy opens back up, low oil prices are a stimulus to the average American because we pay less to fill up our gas tanks. Companies pay less to produce using energy. Homes are cheaper to heat, and there's a whole trickle-down stimulus effect that happens to the economy. Aircraft are cheaper to fly. All that. So there might be more travel, more demand, taking advantage of those lower prices. But this reminds me of what I learned in grad school on the Great Depression. The Great Depression, there was a concern that the demand ran out, and there just simply was no more demand for the supply, and so there's a whole stockpiling of inventory on shelves, and they didn't know how to handle that shock to the system where they had an oversupply sitting in warehouses and people just weren't there to buy it. So that led to collapsed prices and all the rest. So anyway, this kind of reminds me of that scenario. And Oklahoma where they store this, I remember being in New York City back in 2011 in the Bloomberg building and looking at the Bloomberg terminal. And if you don't know what the Bloomberg terminal is, it's a fascinating piece of equipment that made Michael Bloomberg rich. And it was an aggregator of information for day trading and swing trading and whatnot for traders on the floor. So on this device, I saw how you could in real time go and look at all the oil tankers in the world where they were right now. And you could also zoom into Oklahoma where all the oil reserves are stored. It's one of the principal places. The reason it's there is because that's the geographic center of the U.S. So you can look at a satellite and you can zoom in and look at using shadowing effects. This thing could calculate how much capacity and how much supply was there in Oklahoma City. It was the most amazing thing I've ever seen. So I have some background in understanding what this means. It means that all those tanks you can see on the satellite, there ain't no shadows. They're at the top. They're at the top of the brim. So very interesting. How this plays out, this is going to really impact oil-producing countries, including us, including Russia, including the OPEC nations, Mexico. I don't think we've seen the end of this. Okay, so I got cut off Saturday before I got to talk about two things. I was talking about Bill Maher's little clip on panic porn and fear mongering, which is brilliant. If you haven't seen it, go YouTube or look up Bill Maher's rant on panic porn. I think Fox News covered it. I'm not sure if you can get the clip on YouTube, but you can probably get the quote of what he said. But something that I wanted to talk about is the Steele dossier. So there's a joke back during 9/11 that went around my unit at the time. So I was in the Marine Corps during 9/11. I was a young not student pilot. I'd been winged, but I was learning to fly the Cobra attack helicopter. And 9/11 occurred and, changed everybody's life. And that dominated the news cycle for the next years, right? So at the time, there's a person I knew who was scheduled to go stand before a general to go through a disciplinary action for misconduct. He was scheduled to see the general on September 11th. Gary Condit was I think a congressperson from Florida, if memory serves right, and he was under investigation for the disappearance of an intern. I think she was an intern, a staff person in his office, and he was under investigation for that. That was a big story in the summer of 2001, and then 9/11 happened. So the joke in my unit was that there were two people who benefited from 9/11: Gary Condit and this person I knew who was supposed to get disciplinary action taken against him by a general officer. So isn't that what's kind of happening now? We have COVID-19 dominating the news cycle, and yet all this information is coming out about the Steele dossier and about misconduct in the FBI. And it is, I think, big news. And so I wanted to just read what the Washington Post came out with yesterday or 2 days ago by Eric Wemple. So, and I'll just read a little bit of this. So you thought you've heard the last word of the Russian dossier. Did you? Nope. Freshly declassified footnotes from the 2019 Justice Department report cast further doubt on one of the central documents of Russiagate, a collection of memos compiled by former British spy Christopher Steele and published by BuzzFeed in January 2017, the date of Trump's inauguration. The dossier, or the month of Trump's inauguration. The dossier contained extravagant allegations about presidential candidate Donald Trump and was treated to deference in some precincts of the mainstream media. In December 2017, for example, MSNBC host Rachel Maddow spoke in admiring tones about the deep cover sources deployed by Steele. Well, Steele's main source might take issue with Maddow's description, according to the recently released material. When interviewed by the FBI, the primary subsource stated that she did not view her contacts as a network of sources, but rather as friends with whom she has conversations about current events and government relations. That tidbit comes from a batch of footnotes to a December 2019 report from Justice Department Inspector General Michael Horowitz that were declassified this month in two tranches, one from the Justice Department and one from the Office of Director of National Intelligence. The 400-plus page document pounded the FBI for its handling of applications under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, FISA, to wiretap former Trump campaign advisor Carter Page, a process that Horowitz wrote was marred by, quote, 17 significant errors or omissions, end quote. That said, the report concluded that the dossier did not spark the investigation into Trump campaign's ties to Russia, and that the investigation, named Crossfire Hurricane, was properly launched. The FISA applications were powered in part by claims in Steele's dossier, research funded by Hillary Clinton campaign and the Democratic National Committee. As the FBI sought independent confirmation of the Steele claims, it found holes, according to the Horowitz report. The FBI concluded, among other things, that although consistent with known efforts by Russia to interfere in the 2016 U.S. elections, much of the material in the Steele election reports, including allegations about Donald Trump and members of the Trump campaign, relied upon the Carter Page FISA applications, could not be corroborated with certain allegations were inaccurate or consistent with information gathered by the Crossfire Hurricane team, and that the limited information that was corroborated related to time, location, and title information, much of which was publicly available. The declassified footnotes lend texture to that grim assessment. They have been unsheathed at the urging of the Senate Finance Committee, Chuck Grassley, and Senate Homeland Security Committee, Ron Johnson, two critics of the investigation into Trump's ties with Russia. Even a cursory look at the footnotes make clear why they pushed for sunlight. So I won't read the rest of it, but basically these footnotes reveal doubt about the veracity and validity of the Steele dossier's sources. And what we learned a while back is that the Steele dossier was, in fact, the primary document used to obtain the FISA warrant to start to spy on the Trump campaign. And then this led to the Mueller report, of course, and the Russian investigation, the hoax, the collusion hoax, and whatnot. So this is pretty interesting, and we're going to have more come out, I think, before the summer by Michael Horowitz. So be on the lookout for that. I think it's Michael Horowitz. David Horowitz? Anyway, Horowitz. So we're going to have more on that, but this is getting obscured by this COVID-19 story. So I just thought I'd mention it because it's a development that we should be aware of that is continuing. And to me, it calls into question a lot of the premises by which a lot of this investigation was begun. So going back a little bit to the Liberate tweets, I wanted to, something else I posted on Twitter. So a lot of the criticism of Trump are stylistic in my view, and I post this on Twitter. So the critiques are what he said, what he tweeted, and then presumed incompetence because of certain reasons, or what he said or what he tweeted is now indicative of his internal thoughts in terms of being incapable of empathy or, narcissistic or only about himself and his personal benefit and his personal gain. All these require mind reading, and to me are trying to prove too much with what he says and what he tweets. So so I did this tweet this morning, which I thought I'd share. Now I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it real quick, but I may not be able to find it. Let's see. Hopefully you guys aren't hearing this feedback that I'm hearing. So let's see. Oh, I know how to do it. Okay. There we go. Boom. And do. Okay. So the criticism is that because he's a bully, he's toxic, and that has an impact on the country. So I said he's only toxic to at most about half the country. He's only a bully to about the same. Half the country doesn't rest on every single word he says. They allow him some grace. He says a lot of stuff. If you listen to people like Ben Shapiro, he says that on Trump's tombstone, it's going to say, "Here lies Donald Trump, 45th president of the United States." He said a lot of stuff. That was going to be on the epitaph. So, so half the country doesn't rest on every word he says. Half the country does. And I would just encourage, maybe don't rest on every single word he says. Don't kind of ignore what he says. I don't want to say ignore everything he says, but just talk about issues. Talk about the big picture. Don't everything that we deal with in our world doesn't start and end with one person. And if you read some news outlets, and if you listen to some people who are highly emotionally charged about this, literally everything is viewed through the prism of one person or your reaction to one person. And I'm sure you've seen this. Maybe you've felt this yourself, but you've seen this in your friends and family. And I think that's the wrong way to go. That does not connect people. That does not bring people together. So I would implore people who are super critical of the administration to maybe not rest on every single word he says. Maybe just allow some grace. And he certainly speaks his mind. And it's possible to have charitable interpretations of what he says. It is possible. Some of the things he says, I don't agree with. Some of the things are inflammatory and divisive. Yes, absolutely. He knows how to play the political divisiveness game just like anybody. I prefer he take the high ground maneuver. Maybe that's not possible in today's world. I'm not sure. Maybe someday we'll have a person who has a high ground, a higher level conversation. That would be great. Bring us together. But it's certainly not helping that you view all success and all failure through the prism of one person. That's just unhelpful. So there we go. Now, there's a great opinion piece. I want to talk about two more pieces, then I'll let you go, and I'm over an hour already. So there's a great opinion piece by the Wall Street Journal by Eric Wemple, and it's titled "Lockdown Rebellion." And so this is going back to that discussion about pitting people against each other in the lockdown rebellion. So the lockdown rebellion: ordinary Americans protesting to reopen the economy face only contempt from elites. There they go again. Ordinary Americans denying science and refusing to defer to their betters. In state capitals across the country, citizens are protesting the continued coronavirus lockdowns. A CNN critic calls them COVID-19 deniers, notwithstanding that the science they allegedly deny still lacks conclusive answers to some of the most fundamental questions about the coronavirus. So I've been talking about models literally since I started this podcast. I think this is episode 19 or 20. And I've been talking about being skeptical of the models that we have and being too wedded to them, because you make decisions on models, and more importantly, you make decisions on what the models mean and the narrative you tie with the models. And you make decisions that, in some cases with public policy, impact other people. Now, if the models are suspect, or they're inaccurate, or they're off because of assumptions, and we certainly don't know the denominator number of the mortality rate equation, and you're not going to convince me that we do know that, because we don't. We do not know how many people in the population have been infected. There have been suggestions in Germany, Iceland, the USS Teddy Roosevelt. There's a France ship that, and the pregnant women in New York City, and then the antibody test in Santa Clara County. That's six things that have suggested that the amount of infected people it really dwarfs the number of confirmed coronavirus cases. And that's confirmed cases, not fatalities. So if the number of infected dwarfs the number of confirmed, then that denominator is much larger. And that death rate now drops, in my view, it's going to be below 1%. And I'm going to make a public prediction, it's going to be below 1%. That's my public prediction. And I do think it's probably likely it'll be down more towards the 0.1%. I'm going to make it a prediction is going to be 0.06 or so, 0.6, 0.06. I'm off by a magnitude because of the numbers that I've been looking at, but I think it's going to be maybe a little bit worse than the flu. And keep in mind, the flu has a vaccine. So without the vaccine, what would the flu mortality rate be? It would be higher. Now, we don't know how much higher, and there might be models and suggestions out there in the scientific and epidemiology community that suggests what that increase would be. But I think it's going to be a little bit, maybe twice as worse as the flu, maybe 3 times as worse as the flu. It's not going to be, I don't believe it's going to be 10 times or 20 times worse than the flu. I might be in error, but that's my prediction. So now back into the article. In the past week, demonstrations have broken out in Arizona, Colorado, Florida, Idaho, Kentucky, Michigan, Minnesota, North Carolina, Utah, Virginia, and Washington. In Pennsylvania, the state legislature got into the act, sending Governor Tom Wolf a bill that would order much of the state reopened more quickly than he would like. More protests are planned for this week, so we're going to see that. So who are these people? Some are folks who fear a permanent expansion of government and worry when they hear leaders such as New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy saying that constitutional considerations about lockdown measures are above my pay grade. Others are troubled by the First Amendment implications of politicians shutting down churches. The do as I say, not as I do behavior of those imposing these rules isn't busting trust in authorities either. Whether it be Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot going out to get her hair done in New York, or New York Mayor Bill de Blasio being driven to his gym even as they were imploring everyone else to stay home. On Monday, Mark Zuckerberg told George Stephanopoulos on ABC News that Facebook now classifies, quote, a lot of the stuff protesters are saying as harmful misinformation, and that Facebook will take that down. Lost in all this is that the protesters are, for the most part, simply struggling Americans who have concluded that, at least for them, the cure is turning out to be worse than the disease. I've been saying we got to watch for the cure being worse than the disease for literally the last 4 weeks. So yes, and yes. These protesters aren't rich or privileged, says Stephen Moore, a Trump economic advisor. Most are folks living paycheck to paycheck or small business owners seeing their livelihoods destroyed, and they are the ones who are bearing the crushing burden of the lockdown in their states. Yes, exactly. Mr. Moore says he's formed an organization, Save Our Country, to help them ensure their voices are heard. Question for the audience. Who in the audience has lived paycheck to paycheck? Who in the audience has not paid a bill because they didn't have the funds for the month? I've had people who work for me that are in that boat. I've been in that boat. So when you are in that boat, you have any kind of experience with that life, then you will have, I think, way more grace for these protesters than what's being portrayed publicly. So my sense is the people who are criticizing the protesters maybe haven't lived paycheck to paycheck ever in their lives. Maybe they haven't had to bounce a check or forego paying a certain creditor for several months because of lack of funds. Maybe they're weathering this shock because they had a savings account just for this kind of thing, for a black swan event of this nature. So I think some grace is warranted in looking at these protesters. I mean, they're literally protesting, just getting on with their lives. That's never happened before in American society. And to demonize them as anti-science, that's not helpful. That's not helpful. It could be more helpful to acknowledge the concerns and address the concerns and have a public dialogue about, to what degree their concerns are valid, and have a public dialogue about it. Don't demonize people for, getting out and exercising their right to free assembly. Okay, so that's second to last, and last there's a piece in Harvard. So this is let's see. So there's a Twitter thread by Corey DeAngelis. I might be butchering his last name, but he linked to Harvard Magazine, and there was an article titled "The Risks of Homeschooling." The elites, and then his editorializing this Corey person. The elites are terrified that families are figuring out that they can educate their own children at home. And so if you look at this article, he's just sending screenshots. But if you look at this, there's a lot planned. So I'm going to read some more of the thread. I open up the thread now. Harvard's Elizabeth Bartholet, quote, recommends a presumptive ban on homeschooling. The Harvard professor says homeschooling violates children's rights to a meaningful education and their right to be protected from potential child abuse. Some homeschool families have conservative Christian beliefs. Elizabeth says parents currently have authoritarian control over their children. She also says it's always dangerous to put powerful people in charge of the powerless and to give the powerful ones total authority. Oh, the irony. His words, not mine, but I agree with those words. Elizabeth says the burden of proof should be on parents to get permission to homeschool from the government. I think they do in every state. She has it backwards. Our children don't belong to the government. Harvard Law School is also hosting an anti-homeschooling conference in June. The conference is invite only. From the description, quote, the focus will be on problems of educational deprivation and child maltreatment that too often occur under the guise of homeschooling, end quote. Here's a link to the magazine. Here's a link to the anti-homeschooling conference. A bizarre image used on the Harvard Magazine article. It shows a sad homeschool child imprisoned in a house while the other kids are outside playing, having a great time. And the house is made of books. One of them is the Bible. Imagine thinking, one, that a home is a prison, whereas a compulsory government school is not. And two, that homeschool children don't go outside to play. More on that in a second. I think that's the end of the thread. Okay. There's a reply to this that I wanted to archive, but I don't know if it's still, I don't know if I'll be able to, okay. So why do I want to bring this up? One, I went to Harvard for grad school. Two, my wife went to Harvard for undergrad. Three, we homeschool our kids. Four, we are Christians with conservative values. Five, our kids are outside playing every day. Every day. This is just such a fascinating thing to come out of this. And I would like to follow this issue because obviously it's personal to me and my family. And I want to close with this point. So this idea of having a narrative about the way things ought to be, we underestimate how much of our experience we bring into that equation. I was raised in public schools, very, very good public schools. I had a very good education and very good opportunities from that education. So it was strange to me to give over control of that issue and allow some experimentation with the homeschooling thing. My wife was homeschooled, not entirely, but for part of her childhood. So I wanted to be open to it and respectful of it, but I was a little bit cautious and nervous and wondered if it would degrade the education of my children. I'm learning that it doesn't. And the homeschooling experience is, of course, only as good as the parent and their interest in taking it seriously and nurturing their child and having them grow. But our experience with it has allowed me to be more comfortable with it. I still have, things I'll work through as time goes on, as the curriculum gets more complex, as I age and get older. And certainly there could be a time where we want to put them back in the school system or a school system of some sort. So that's one issue that I've had to take my own personal experience, drawing a narrative of the way things ought to be, and then taking potentially disconfirming information, incorporating that in the narrative. And I was resistant to it, this homeschooling idea. But we've gone through with it, and we've done it for about the last 2 years. So I have my oldest is 6 years old. So it's been pretty good, and he knows what he needs to know at his level. He doesn't know everything yet, but he knows he's progressing with where he needs to be for his level. And if you look at the curriculums of where they need to be for certain ages, he's right there, and he enjoys it, and he loves learning. He's not forced into a one-size-fits-all structure that some kids aren't responsive to. Some kids are bored. Some kids are fidgety because they want to go out and play. They're not paying attention. And then they get, early on in their development, they get this negative feedback loop with school, right? This means no fun. But if you have the capability, and certainly public schools and any school can do this with good teachers, but not all, certainly. But if you can make the learning process fun and rewarding to the child, to the student, then they're not going to get this negative experience early in their development with school. So that's been my experience. Now, the other thing I'll say is in medicine. So I was, my dad was a pre-med, chemistry, biology major in college, and a master's in clinical chemistry, and ended up not going to medical school, but worked in the medical field for a big company. And so my life was grown up around medicine and medication for issues, and that was just the normal way of things, right? And it wasn't until I met my wife, who's from the Midwest, and the Midwest had a lot more mom solutions, dad solutions, home remedies for things, because the population was dispersed, agricultural community. You had doctors, but they were maybe hundreds of miles away, and it wasn't as prevalent as where I grew up in the suburbs. And so, if you were running a household, you had to learn some home remedies to certain things. And so I saw that, and then I became very skeptical of experts in the medical field when I was actually at Harvard, because of a diagnosis that my wife received for something that she was seen for. It completely out of the blue diagnosis. And then on our own, we researched the issue, and with a couple tweaks in the diet, the issue went away. Now, the medical professional didn't suggest any diet issues, didn't even ask about diet. And so that led me to, that was, again, my narrative, strongly tied to the medical, American medicine and American healthcare. And then I suddenly was opened to other ways of thinking about our health, our nutrition, what we're consuming, our rest, our exercise, herbal things that you can do. And for a brief while, my wife considered going to be a naturopath doctor, an ND. So that she ended up not doing that, but she looked at that for a while, and I didn't even know those existed. So, and even in public health, when I was at Harvard, there was a classmate of mine who was trying to meld Eastern and Western medicine, so there was a more comprehensive approach to medicine, and there were things we could in America and the Western medicine learn from Eastern medicine, and things like acupuncture and pulse diagnosis and other things. So, anyway, personal examples of my own narrative, and having potentially disconfirming information coming in through people I love and respected, being resistant to it, being skeptical of it, which is fine, and then allowing some of it to come in, and over time to change my narrative outlook on those things. So I'll leave you with that. I hope that helped. I hope that you can take inventory of your own narrative about certain issues, about information coming in, and whether you're rejecting it, whether you're looping that into your confirmation bias, and it's activating high emotion in you about a particular topic, or if you're developing techniques to have grown-up conversations and grown-up thoughts about things and not degrade into a fifth grade shouting match at recess. So if you enjoyed it, like the video, give me a thumbs up, subscribe. If you're interested in supporting this, DM me on Twitter. One of my goals for incremental improvements down the range is to offer ways to support this channel, because I would love to do this on a more regular basis. I'm doing this because I'm unemployed right now, but it would be fun to do this more permanently. And just one pitch for this, and if you're watching all the way to this, then maybe this will spark your interest. But all the news outlets, New York Times, Washington Post, National Review, a lot of the really quality ones, even Fox News and CNN, you have to subscribe to a cable subscription for those. You have to subscribe to the New York Times. You have to subscribe to the Washington Post online. Ben Shapiro Show, other organizations, Vox, has a subscription model. So all these different sources have subscription, and it's tough to have a gazillion subscriptions, right? Not impossible. I have many, but why not consider a different sense of getting your news? And that is an aggregator of news of sorts who can help equip you with some techniques and practices to be more discerning of the information coming into your brain and have more grown-up conversations, to raise the level of dialogue with your friends and family, to have a raised awareness from across multiple domains of knowledge, and to be better equipped to think in the future. Maybe that's a role I could play. And if that's the role I could play for you, then maybe consider helping me out. And again, DM me if you have any expertise on how to set that up in a website to receive funds, because I don't know that I have the time to do that at this point. I'll make the time if it has to be me. But if you have expertise or information on that, please DM me. If you want to help out, please DM me. Thanks, guys. Love you. Joel Van Brunt signing off, bearing the brunt. Maybe I'll try a different title tomorrow. If you like the title, let me know, and I will talk to you later.